I had someone private message me on Instagram the other day saying, hey, you should do a video on the Bulls' top 5 trades in franchise history, and I thought, that's actually a good video suggestion, but when I took a step back and thought about it, are there really even 5 good trades that this franchise has made? And not without sounding too negative, there actually have been some decent trades that were made by the Bulls in their history, but because more bad trades have come right to my mind when the suggestion was made, I thought, well, first I would put out a video on the Bulls' 5 worst trades in franchise history, and then later this week I'll put out a video on their top 5 trades, so stay tuned for that. Also, guys, if you ever have video suggestions or recommendations, topics you would like to see discussed, I am always open to hearing it. I mean, I always end up making a video on it, but I always appreciate the suggestions nonetheless. Also, real quick, the channel is closely approaching 9,000 subscribers, and I mentioned before I am planning on doing a big giveaway when the channel reaches 10,000, so if you want to be included and you want to make sure that you don't miss the giveaway announcement, well, then make sure you're subscribed to the channel with bell notifications so you don't miss a video. According to my analytics, about 70% of you tuning into the channel aren't subscribed, so if you like the content, consider subscribing and you'll also be included in the 10,000 subscriber giveaway. But enough about that, let's get into today's topic. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. So over the course of the Bulls franchise history of 55 seasons dating all the way back to 1966, the Bulls have made some good moves, like drafting the likes of Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, which led to the creation of a dynasty team, to then also making some very bad decisions that really cost the franchise decades of being irrelevant. Well, in this video, we're specifically going to be looking at trades, not free agency acquisitions, draft selections, just trades. I actually made a video a while back on the Bulls' top 5 worst draft picks of all time, so feel free to check that out if you missed it. And because it's the off season, I likely will do a top 5 best draft picks in franchise history, as well as top free agency acquisitions and worst free agency acquisition, sometime this summer. As these videos, I wanted to make them for a while, and the off season is probably the best time to do so. But when it comes to trades that the Bulls franchise has made in their history, which, like any franchise, there are a lot of trades that have been made in the course of 55 seasons. There are a handful that truly stand out as the worst trades ever made, some that were so bad it almost makes you think, how the hell did some of these GMs actually even get their jobs in the first place? And even worse, how are they able to hold on to their job for that long? Now, the way that I'm ranking these trades as far as how bad they were is I'm basing it off of how well did the incoming players perform after joining the Bulls, and how well the outgoing players that the Bulls traded performed when they went to their new team or over the course of the rest of their career. Not only that, but also basing it off of a need, because sometimes you might bring in a player because there is a serious hole in the roster that needs to be addressed, and the guy coming in is the ideal fit, the perfect fit for what you need on the roster, and just didn't meet expectations. That isn't that bad of a trade. What's worse is when you make a trade for a player who absolutely does not fit on the roster at the time that the trade was made. So let me start with a few honorable mentions before I get into the 5 worst, starting with the Bulls trading Nikola for the New Orleans Pelicans first round pick, which the Bulls ultimately used to select Chandler Hutchinson, who barely played for the Bulls because he was always injured, and even when he did play, he wasn't that effective, and of course he turned out to be petty and an immature little bitch. And given Mirotić was a very productive player, you would expect to obtain more for him in return. Now granted, a first round pick is actually pretty decent. I guess it was more so that the Bulls really wasted that trade by drafting Hutchinson. And then our next honorable mention is trading Jason Caffey for a second round pick in 1998, right after the Last Dance season. Caffey didn't go really on to have a stellar season or a great career by any means, but I really liked him as a player and his game coming off the bench for the Bulls in those years, and the fact that the Bulls simply traded him at a young age for a second round pick was just brutal. But really every transaction that was made that offseason was brutal as a whole. This one is probably really minor in comparison. And then finally, our last honorable mention is the Bulls trading Justin Holiday and Derrick Rose for Jose Calderon, Jerian Grant, and Robin Lopez. Now, I get that at the time you could argue that this trade made sense given the dynamic between Rose and Butler, that it clearly wasn't working between them, and of course it looked like although Rose was improving, he was never going to be the same player that he once was in his MVP year. But knowing what we know now, and not to mention the fact that Justin Holiday is still a very serviceable player, especially since the Bulls brought him back later on, but that was such a little return for someone like Derrick Rose. Despite all of the injuries and the fact that he was on an expiring deal, you're talking about Jose Calderon, who actually never played for the Bulls. The Bulls moved on from him in order to free up cap space to sign Dwayne Wade to that ridiculous contract. Jerrion Grant was a bust, and the Bulls didn't hang on to him long before trading him to the Magic and is now already out of the league. Robin Lopez was actually really the only piece in that package that was a good pickup for the Bulls, but nothing to get super excited about when you're trading a former MVP. The only reason I didn't put this into my 5 worst trades is because, well, Rose's value wasn't really that high at the time, so you can't really expect to get a lot for him, but still, that was a pretty lousy return, especially now knowing what we know about Rose and how effective and impactful he still is as a player in this league. Okay, let's get into our 5 worst trades of all time for the Chicago Bulls, and coming in at number 5 is the Toni Kukoc trade. Now, after the front office decided to blow up the dynasty and go into a rebuild, Toni Kukoc quickly became the team's best player, and he was putting up some of the best numbers of his career, which he kind of had to, given the fact that he was now the number 1 option on the team. But in 2000, Jerry Krause couldn't help but think, with Kukoc's value really high right now, what could I get in a trade for him since he's 31 years old and will likely start declining? Well, Krause traded Toni Kukoc, a guy who was averaging 18 points per game, for John Starks, a well past his prime John Starks, I might add, who they later waived anyway, and Golden State's first round pick, which was the number 7 selection in the 2000 draft, which the Bulls used to select Chris Mihm. Now, the 2000 draft class has always been known as one of the most underwhelming draft classes of all time, but still, to trade your best player, who was still a very effective player at the time, for Chris Mihm. Now, granted, the Bulls did in fact trade Chris Mihm for Jamal Crawford in the same draft, which was actually a good trade, but of course, they didn't end up hanging on to Jamal Crawford when they actually traded him a few years later, and that was even worse, which you'll see here in a little bit. At number 4, the Doug McDermott trade on draft night. So in the 2014 NBA draft, the Bulls, through prior trades, were lucky enough to end up with the 16th and 19th pick in the draft. Now, it was speculated that the Bulls would look to move up in the draft by packaging those 2 picks for a higher pick, but rather than even trying to move up into the top 10, the Bulls traded both of their first round picks for the 11th pick to select Doug McDermott. Now, the reason for this was because the Bulls knew they needed high-quality shooters. It was always an area where they lacked at the time, and of course, Doug McDermott was the College Player of the Year, one of the best shooters and scorers in college history, which is why he was given the name Dougie McBuckets. But of course, McDermott never really lived up to that hype, and not only did he not play well for the Bulls anyway, he really just hasn't shown up that well even post playing with the Chicago Bulls, and the Bulls later traded him away just 2.5 seasons later, which was also another really bad trade, by the way, when they traded Taj Gibson and McDermott for Cameron Payne and a couple of other non-factor players who were out of the league shortly thereafter. Now, the reason I consider this trade to be so bad, other than McDermott never really performing well in the NBA and being a consistent shooter for the Bulls and really a god-awful defender, is, well, they traded him for 2 picks, which ultimately ended up in Yusuf Nurkic and Gary Harris, which I'm not saying that they're incredible players or stars by any means, but they've shown to be very impactful and productive players in this league that the Bulls certainly could have used in those seasons with Jimmy Butler rather than McDermott. Like, that would have never happened today. A team would not trade 2 first-round picks, being the 16th and 19th pick, just to move up to the 11th. That is insane. You have to at least be able to move up to the 8th pick if you're trading 2 mid-first rounders. Anyway, that trade still makes my blood boil. Now, next at number 3, we've got the Kyle Korver trade. This one might surprise you because I'm sure most people don't remember this one, but the reason this one is so high on the list is because although Korver, a decent player for the Bulls, wasn't the most consistent one when he was with us in those initial Derrick Rose years. So in the 2012 offseason, the Bulls decided to trade Korver to the Hawks for a trade exception and cash considerations. That's it, not even a player in return. Now, this was shortly after Derrick Rose tore his ACL, and so I'm sure the Bulls could use that trade exception for the added money to their cap and the cash because they had just lost their cash cow in Rose. But trading Korver for that, Kyle Korver went on to be an all-star for the Atlanta Hawks in 2015. Granted, he should have never been selected as an all-star. That was ridiculous that he even made an all-star team. But regardless, he played very well going to Atlanta and even had some good years playing in Cleveland with LeBron James shortly after that. So trading Korver for cash when he was only 30 years old and still in this prime, and went on to have some great season, is a pretty bad trade in hindsight. At number 2, Jamal Crawford. So I referenced this one earlier in that the Bulls actually turned the Chris Mims selection in 2000 into the trade that they had for Kukoc in snagging Jamal Crawford. Now, Crawford struggled his first couple seasons with the Bulls, but by his 3rd season and going into his 4th season, he was looking poised to become a star in the league with incredible ball handling, smooth ability to get to the hoop, and a great mid-range jumper. He was turning into a very consistent scorer, and although his defense was never really there, he made up for it in the sense that he was also a decent playmaker. Now, in 2004, the Bulls were put into a very similar situation that they are right now with Lauri, Markkanen, in that Jamal Crawford was a restricted free agent, and the Bulls had the ability to match any offer Crawford received in order to retain him. But instead of doing that, the Bulls did a sign-and trade for Dikembe Mutombo, Othello Harrington, Frank Williams, and Cesare Trebanski. Yeah, I'm pretty sure most of us have never even heard of the last 3 players, which you wouldn't because they barely stayed in the league after this trade. And then Dikembe Mutombo, well, by 2004, he was well past his prime, which was fine because the Bulls then used Mutombo as a trade asset to move him just 1 month later for Eric Piayatsku, Adrian Griffin, and Mike Wilkes. Yeah, so essentially the Bulls traded Jamal Crawford, who was an incredible scorer and went on to win 3 Sixth Man of the Year awards. Not only, but he also had a very long and consistent career all the way into his late 30s. He only retired just this past season, but they traded all of that for a bunch of guys that we've never heard of. Who knows what would have been had we held on to Jamal Crawford once the Bulls drafted Rose and we had a backcourt of Derrick Rose and Jamal Crawford together. But as bad as that trade was, nothing takes the cake than the draft night trade the Bulls made in 2006 when the Bulls had the number 2 pick in the draft and selected LaMarcus Aldridge, but to then later trade him for Tyrus Thomas, who was the number 4 selection, Victor Cryapa, who knows who that is, and a 2nd round pick for LaMarcus Aldridge. LaMarcus Aldridge, a 7-time All-Star, a 5-time All-NBA player, the big man with the sweet mid-range jumper, could crash the boards and battle guys in the paint. You traded that away for Tyrus Thomas, a guy who never ended up playing in the NBA all that well and was a 2nd round pick. And in case you were wondering who the 2nd round pick ended up becoming, it was Demetrius Nichols. Never heard of him? Well, yeah, that's because he only played all but 18 games in his NBA career, 11 of which were with the Bulls. So yes, the Bulls have made some bad trades over the years, but I can't think of a single one that tops this when you had the chance to have a perennial All-Star and All-NBA player, a guy who averaged over 23 points per game and 10 rebounds in his prime, for Tyrus Thomas, a guy who only managed to play 8 seasons in the league and had his best season averaging just 10 points per game. Now, every team has had their fair share of bad trades. I don't think the Bulls are any exception to this. In fact, there have been a lot of worse trades throughout league history than the ones that I just mentioned. You might have been a little surprised that I didn't include Jimmy Butler in this one, and that's because I actually don't consider that to be all that bad of a trade. I did at the time that it was made, but in hindsight, I think the Bulls made the right move in trading Jimmy Butler, just given the fact that Jimmy was not happy in Chicago. And I'll actually address that in my top 5 Bulls trades of all time later this week. Until then, I want to know what you guys think though of these trades. I'm sure there might have been some that I missed or left out. Let me know in the comments if I did or how you would rank these trades. As always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.